Last week I was here, last time I was here, I covered Revelation 13. So if you missed that, you can request the sermon. In fact, we'll put all these sermons together in a whole prophecy series. And it may be the most significant series on prophecy that you've ever heard. Not because I gave them, but because it's a combination of what I've studied over the past 50 years. In fact, the first time I studied Daniel 2 was back in 1958. It's a long time ago. I saw some of the parts of the puzzle then, but I've had to live much longer to see more parts of the puzzle. And I tell you, as I view the world right now, and I keep up with world events, and I study the map, and I see where all these events are happening, for the first time in my life, I am scared for mankind. Because that's amazing, because for many, many years, back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and when we went to the year 2000, and all kinds of people pronounced and prognosticated and said, oh, this is going to happen, that's going to happen, that's going to happen, I was the one to say, no, it won't. And the reason I could say that is because I always went back to the Scripture and looked exactly what the Scripture said. And I looked at the world and I knew what was happening. I've studied international relations and geopolitics, and I know the world. I've traveled extensively in Europe, Africa, Australia, 49 states of the United States, Canada. I've seen a lot. I've read a lot. I've listened a great deal. And I've studied the Bible extensively, and I know every word in the book of Revelation. And I keep studying, and I keep asking myself, well, where are we wrong? Because the only way you correct yourself is when you ask yourself, well, where could I be wrong? If I always say I'm right, I won't learn anything. Critical thinker, critical of my own thinking. So now we get to Revelation 17. There came one of the seven angels which had the seven vials, and he talked with me, saying, come, I will show unto you the judgment of the great whore that sits upon many waters. Here's a vision that John saw, and when he saw something, he wrote it. He wrote it as he saw it, so we can kind of mentally see the picture. So we see a great whore that sits upon many waters. And we can ask, what does that mean? Well, just keep reading. I've kept saying in the past few sermons, if you've learned nothing from these sermons, learn to keep reading. Just keep reading. It says, this whore with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names and blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. What are these 7 heads and 10 horns? You may say, well, we just read about that in Revelation 13, because there we found 7 heads and 10 horns. And the answer is that's not correct. See, back in Revelation 13, it talked about a specific thing. A beast that had 7 heads and 10 horns. The 7 heads back there were the original heads of Babylon, 1, Persia, 1, Greece had 4 heads, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then Rome, 7 heads, and then the 10 horns were 10 successive kingdoms that would come out of that Roman Empire. The first three was when Rome was overrun by the Vandals, Heruli, and the Ostrogoths, three nations that ruled Italy, and then they were plucked out by the root, as it says in the book of Daniel. At the behest of the Pope, Justinian came over from Constantinople, and he pushed those barbarians out of Italy and resurrected the Roman Empire in Rome. So this beast we're talking about now, on which the woman sits. Who is the woman? As we go through, we'll find out it's the church. A great big false church. And a lot of people understand that. They haven't always been willing to say it out loud. Martin Luther, the great German Protestant reformer, the first Bible he published in the German language, he had a picture put in here by Revelation 17 of the great harlot that sat upon the beast, mother of harlots. And he actually put it in his Bible until somebody pointed out to him, hey, that means she is our mother and we are one of her daughters. So the next Bibles that were published, they took the picture out. But here's a scarlet-colored beast, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. What are these 7 heads and 10 horns? Well, we don't know yet. Let's read. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and the abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman. How can we identify the woman? Well, let's see what she does. And I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints and with the martyrs, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. Here's what she would do. She would kill the true saints of God. She would make war with them. And it's very easy to just go back 2,000 years through history and see who did the killing. Holy wars called crusades. Killing under the cross, the banner of the cross. Verse 7, and the angel said unto me, Wherefore did you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and 10 horns. I'll explain it to you. You don't have to guess. We don't have to guess. The beast that you saw was and is not. It'll disappear. There will be times when you'll be looking for this beast and you won't find her. Or him. And finally shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not and yet is. That sounds Greek to me. Something that was and is not yet is. Which means it was and then disappears, and yet it still is. And here is the mind which has wisdom. Here is a clear explanation for you. What are the 7 heads? The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. Ask yourself, did the church rule over Babylon? No, because when Nebuchadnezzar was the ruler of Babylon, the church hadn't come to existence yet. What about the Persian Empire? Was the church back there? No. What about the Greek Empire? Was the church back there? No, it's long before the church came about. So did the woman sit on those heads? Well, obviously not, because the woman hadn't come to the fore yet. So what are the heads that the woman sits on? Well, some people have looked at this and say, well, this is obviously talking about Rome, because Rome is built on the 7 hills of Rome. When you go to Rome as a tourist, which we've done a couple of times, that's one of the first things you hear, the 7 hills of Rome. However, we were back in Revelation 13, and we saw that the Pope actually crowned certain rulers as the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. The first one was Justinian. That was followed by Charlemagne, 800 AD, the French leg of the Holy Roman Empire. That was followed by Otto the Great up in Germany, also crowned by the Pope as the emperor over the Holy Roman Empire. And that was followed by Charles the Great over toward the east. And that was followed by Napoleon. And I've told the story, which you've heard before maybe, and you will hear undoubtedly again. When the Pope was about to pick up the crown and put it on Napoleon's head, Napoleon leaned forward and he picked up the crown himself and put it on his own head. I'm sure to somewhat of the disgust of quite a few people who thought he shouldn't have done that. But that's not the complete story. Revelation 13 said that that would continue for 1260 days or 1260 years in prophecy. And we have the exact dates in history. From 554, Justinian's restoration of the Roman Empire, 554, 1260 years on top of that brings you, if you add those two together, to 1814 when Napoleon abdicated. And that was a stretch in history. It's a long stretch in history, over 1,000 years, in which the church in Rome ruled over the kingdoms of Europe. But here it says there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen. We've just looked at the 5 that are gone. Then somewhere in history, when you read this, you would have seen, and one is. And the other is not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short space. You see, if you had these books available to you all through the centuries, any time in that period of time, you could have looked at this book and you could have figured out where you were in history. When everybody was lauding the fact that Charlemagne was being crowned as king of or emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in 800 AD, if you were a Christian back there, a true Christian, looking at what was happening, you would have said, wait a bit. I know better. This is not a Holy Roman Empire. This is the world's empire, and we know who the God of this world is. Later on, when Napoleon came to the fore and was fighting against the British, and then decided to go fight against the Russians and burn Moscow to the ground, which he did. If you were a Christian at that time and knowing these prophecies, you would have said, yeah, this is number 5. See, some people may have said, oh, this is the end of the world. And you would have said, no, it's not. Now, some of you are familiar with the work of Herbert Armstrong, who started preaching back in 1927, who then started a magazine called The Plain Truth. The first issue was in 1934. Like many preachers back in the 1930s, Armstrong wondered where we were in prophecy, and things looked ominous, and people were preaching about the end of the world. So the very first Plain Truth magazine, the very first article that ever appeared, was entitled, "A World Dictator About to Appear." Imagine if you had written that in 1934. Would have thought that was either crazy or very significant. A world dictator about to appear. It wasn't headline news. The amazing thing is that the dictator that Herbert Armstrong was looking at was Mussolini, who had just proclaimed himself as King of Rome. So he had the story right, but the wrong person. Because just north of that, 1 year before, 1933, a former corporal of World War II, Adolf Hitler, from Austria, had seemingly miraculously became chancellor of the most educated country on the face of the earth, the country of Germany. That's 1933. And for everything I've read in history, there were only 2 people who looked at that man and realized what he was up to. The first one was Winston Churchill, at that time Lord of the Admiralty, in charge of the Navy of England, who said, "Watch out for this man in Germany." Nobody wanted to believe him. Nobody in England wanted to believe him. And Herbert Armstrong, who said, "A world dictator about to appear." But as I said, Armstrong was looking at the wrong man, but very quickly realized who the real dictator was. So when World War II broke out, only 6 years later, it only took 6 years, from 1933 to 1939, when World War II started, when Germany made a treaty with Stalin, the leader of Russia, to basically carve Poland into 2 and take 1/2 each. The British had a treaty with Poles that said, if you get attacked, we will come defend you. That's how Britain ended up in World War II. Britain, France, the other countries. They followed a period of about 6 months called the Phony War, when nothing happened. And then came what was called Blitzkrieg, lightning war. And within 6 weeks, Think of this. Imagine 6 weeks from today. Imagine today nothing's happening, and 6 weeks from today, Germany had conquered all of Western Europe, including Norway, all the way down through Holland and Denmark and Belgium and France, and the German swastika was flying over the Eiffel Tower. And the British Expeditionary Force, as it was called, had to be rescued from the coasts of Dunkirk, the miracle of Dunkirk, when Churchill had called upon any ship that could float to cross the English Channel and go fetch the troops. And they did. Every small fishing vessel to the biggest destroyer sailed across the English Channel and picked up over 600,000 troops and brought them back to England and saved them to be able to fight again. Those were dark days. And even Armstrong, when he looked at that, thought, like many preachers did, that this could be the end of the world. You see, we live in peaceful times now. It's hard for us to imagine what was going on back there. At that time, most Americans didn't want to be involved in the war, and we had people who were pacifists or people who were pro-German who said, no, we don't need to go fight in Europe. And so 1939, 1940, 1941, all passed. The Battle of Britain was fought and won by the British. The Battle of the Atlantic was being fought, where the Germans were blowing up everything that moved in the Atlantic with their U-boats. Terrible time. The Americans were assisting through the Lend-Lease Act by sending armaments across. But the Americans didn't want to be involved in the war. All that changed December the 7th, a Sunday, when Japanese planes bombed Pearl Harbor and sunk many ships, and thankfully the 3 American aircraft carriers were not there. They had left. They were somewhere in the Pacific. And Admiral Yamamoto, as they sailed away from that battle area, realized, as he said, all we have done is we have pulled the tail of the tiger. He realized all he had done was woken America. The rest is history. Terrible toll of invading Europe and then fighting the Japanese, and the final end of World War II in 1945. About halfway through the war, Herbert Armstrong changed what he was saying. He had been saying this could be the end of the world. He had seen, like the world did, Rommel's German armies heading across North Africa, heading for the Middle East. And it seemed so much like many of the prophecies in the Old Testament about armies heading into the Middle East and occupying the Middle East. But Rommel never got to the Middle East. He was stopped by Lord Montgomery's 8th Army in North Africa. The first ground victory by the British. The first little ray of hope for the Allies. And then Hitler, of course, made the mistake of attacking Russia, breaking his treaty with Stalin and attacking Russia. And the Russians ending up losing 20 million people in the war. Almost the population of Texas. Wiped out. See, what Herbert Armstrong did was he started counting how many resurrections of the Roman Empire had there been. Justinian, Charlemagne, Otto the Great, Charles the Great, Napoleon, Hitler. 6. So he said, there's another one coming. So halfway through the war, he was preaching, Germany will rise again, which was an amazing thing to be preaching while Germany was being bombed to smithereens. There's only been one time in history when verse 10 was being fulfilled. There were 7 kings, 5 are fallen, 1 is. The time of World War II. And the other is not yet come, and when he comes, he must continue a short space. Where are we in history? Right after the comma of is. 1 is, and the other one is yet to come. That's where we are. When he comes, it must continue a short space. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th. Oh, we thought he was the 7th. How can he be the 8th? Very simple. The first beast was the Roman Empire before it was wounded and it had to be resurrected. The Roman Empire of the Caesars. You see, the woman didn't ride that head of the Roman Empire. That's the 8th one. So if you go back and you count the Caesars as number 1, and then Justinian, etc., you get yourself 8. Just to make it absolutely sure. That's what the Bible did. Just make it very simple. Verse 12. Now we come to what will we see in the future. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings which receives no kingdom as yet, but receive power as king 1 hour with the beast. And it introduces another beast. The beast being the final leader of this future resurrected Roman Empire. So the 10 horns are 10 kings which have no kingdom at all right now, but will have power as kings 1 hour with the beast. And for years, those of us who watched Europe saw 6 nations of the original Commonwealth, not Commonwealth, Common Market. The original Common Market. And we looked at them and we looked at them and we wondered, well, when will they become 10? And I used to watch that. I discussed them with Herbert Armstrong. I knew him well. And Herbert Armstrong died and I kept watching. And then one day I was sitting in my lounge in Johannesburg, South Africa. My youngest son was there. He was in high school, very clever boy. And at that time there were 26 nations in Europe. 26. And I said to myself and to my son, where were we wrong? 26 nations. And the end has not come. We always thought if there were 10, the end would come. Now there were 26. Today there are 28. And as soon as I asked the question, I knew the answer. What was the answer? Very simple. The Bible says 10 kings. It does not say 10 nations or groups of nations. That is so simple that I had to kind of shake my head and say, well, why didn't you see that before? The Bible says 10 kings. And as soon as I started thinking kings instead of nations, all kinds of things came to mind because I suddenly remembered. You have royal families scattered all over Europe. They're all interrelated. Last night I wrote something to people I write to, and I pointed out that Nicholas II of Russia was the cousin of George V of England. They're family members. I think I've mentioned before to this church that when they found what they thought were the remains of the Romanov family, the last royal family of the Russians, the immediate royal family, they're still, which I just heard this past week over the radio, that there are still members of the Russian royal family alive today. But anyway, they found what they thought were the remains of the Romanov family that had been butchered, killed by the Bolsheviks, the Russian communists, and they wanted to give them a proper funeral if they could prove that they were actually the remains. So thankfully, in the modern day of DNA, they took DNA samples off the bones, and then they checked the DNA. Among others, they checked the DNA with, surprise, surprise, Prince Philip, husband to Queen Elizabeth II of England. And they found it was a match, because you see Prince Philip is a member of the royal families of Denmark and of Greece, to which the Romanovs were also related. So I went on a study of the royal families of Europe, and this one book was quite fascinating. It says, when the royals get together, most of us know nothing about it. They get together for weddings, for funerals, for baptisms. All the royals of Europe gather. Interesting, yesterday I was checking on my computer the family relationship between the royal family of England and the original royal family of Russia. And under the images page on the computer, it showed me about 200 pictures, family photos of the Windsors, which is the royal family of England, and the Romanov family. 200 family pictures showing those two families together. You see, there's a world out there we know nothing about. That's not unusual because most people do not know very much anyway. Reminds me of a friend, Gerald Waterhouse, years ago, who said, it's not hard to understand that the dead know not anything, as it says in the book of Psalms, that the dead know not anything, because those of us who are alive don't know very much. Yes. what does the prophecy say? It doesn't say 10 nations and groups of nations. It says there are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but will receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. Very short space of time. So if you want to keep watching Europe. Don't worry about all these nations. You know, the boundaries of the nations of Europe have been drawn and redrawn so many times. Same thing in the Middle East, same thing in Africa. Those man-made boundaries mean nothing. Amazingly, those families are still there. Verse 13, these have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. Something will cause these leaders of Europe to turn to somebody who is strong enough to intervene for them. I will speak more about this in my next sermon. Don't miss it. Because this jigsaw puzzle, which we call prophecy, those pieces are getting together so amazingly right now that it is a bit scary. And I read not all of them, but quite a few magazines put out by the Churches of God. I've tried to point out to some of them some of these things, but they just hang on to what they believed back in the 60s and 70s, like I used to. But you have to sometimes ask yourself, well, where were you wrong? And as soon as you do that, then you start seeing things a little clearer. Verse 14, these shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them. For he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called, chosen and faithful. And he said unto me, the waters which you saw, which are on which the whore sits, what are the waters she sits on? It explains it right here. They are multitudes and nations and tongues, people of all languages, multitudes. And the 10 horns which you saw upon the beast, these shall hate the whore. They'll finally realize who she really is. They will turn on her, and they shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put in their hearts to fulfill his will, and to grieve and give their kingdom unto the beast, until the words of God shall be fulfilled. And the woman which you saw is that great city, which reigns over the kings of the earth. What is that city? It is Rome. So we end chapter 17. And chapter 17 ends the same as how Daniel 2 ended, with the 10 toes representing 10 kings that will exist on earth before the kingdom is given unto the saints of the Most High. So Revelation 17 ends where Daniel 2, the framework of prophecy, ended. What's the message for us? Well, in chapter 18, which you could read that chapter, which predicts the fall of Babylon, the whole thing will end. At verse 4, and I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people. You know, the whole world has been sucked into what is basically a false Christianity. Chances are there's nowhere on earth you can go now where, you can go to far-flung China, into some village way off, thousands of miles from here, and you'll find some Chinese peasant sitting there making little figurines of Jesus. of a stable and a Christmas tree. And if you were to ask her, what are you doing? She'll have no idea. She's doing it because she gets paid for doing it. And all this stuff is put in containers and sent over to America. And we sell it to a Hobby Lobby, nice Christian store, where you can go in and hear jingle bells and "O come ye all ye faithful" being played as people buy all this stuff that has nothing to do, really, with the truth of God. Not because they're bad people, but because they're deceived people. They can go back and read American history and find out that the original settlers that landed in the United States did not keep Christmas because they thought it a pagan festival that came from Rome. And Christmas was not made a national holiday in the United States, believe it or not, until after the Civil War. It's amazing. And yet now we all just suck it up and say, ooh, this is it. And that's a small thing by comparison to people actually going out and killing other Christians. And you may say they'll never do that. Well, stick around. Some people fear the Muslims, and maybe they should. And they fear what's happening in Syria. Yes, there are bad things happening. But what are you going to do when Christians start killing Christians again? As Jesus said, when they start killing you and think they're doing God a service. It can happen. It will happen. So I hope you've benefited going back over these chapters. Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Revelation 13 and 17. The story's not finished. Because next time I'd like to focus on something I've never focused on in a prophecy sermon. And that is the history of Russia. I've never heard a sermon given on it. But it's interesting. Why should Russia be involved in the Middle East? That's interesting. Where is Russia on the map? Have you ever checked that? For so long, most of us just put Russia over there with the Chinese, communists, people of the East. Have you ever looked at Putin, the leader of Russia? Is he Asian? Never thought about it. No, he's not Asian, he's European. Suddenly, things could get exciting in the world.